You're listening to Breaking Biz Dev with John Tyerman and Mark Wainwright. Conversations that break down, beat up, and redefine business development for the professional services firms of tomorrow. And now for your hosts, John and Mark.
Hello, business developers. Welcome to another episode of Breaking Biz Dev. I'm John. As always, I'm joined by my trusty co-host, Mark Wainwright. Mark, how are you doing today?
I'm well, John. Good to be with you today. We're going to talk about revenue at professional services firms that are hitting the mid-year point in their calendar year. Maybe they are looking at their plans, their projections, and maybe they're falling short. Maybe they're doing great. Maybe they're right on target. Maybe things are going incredibly well. Who knows? But we're gonna dig into all of that.
Yeah, for folks that are just tuning in, we have an episode 4, titled Revenue-Centric Approach to Firm Strategy, where we dive into how to set those targets. And so if you're listening to this and you want to kind of get a little bit of a primer for this episode, go back and listen to that one. I think that's a good setting of the stage for our conversation today. If you've already listened to that episode, awesome. I think you're coming to the table with the right mindset. And I would say that this is really kind of a recalibration of your revenue strategy, of your marketing strategy, of your sales strategy. So I think this is going to be a really good episode to dig into. And I think it'll be actionable for a lot of firms out there.
Good. Yeah, I totally agree. Maybe a little recap. I've written and spoken about all of this in the past throughout this episode and likely that other potential episodes that we're going to be recording. We talk about things like backlog, we talk about pipeline, we talk about projections, and all of those things are all tied together. And just to take this quick pause and define all that, your backlog is the work that you have under contract, whether it's shorter term or longer term. And if you're picturing with me that sort of graph that you have a wonderful backlog right now, you've got a lot of work under contract, and over time that tapers, right? 6 months, 12 months into the future. Your pipeline are all of the potential projects that backfills that, right? You're hoping to contract that work, and that will then become your backlog as well and continue that nice revenue stream that you're hoping to close. The projections, and we'll touch a little bit on sort of the concept of projections. Projections are going to be even further out from that. Projections are the things that kind of pie in the sky, your crystal ball, things that aren't closing for many, many months. They're not quite in your pipeline yet, because we want things in our pipeline that are going to close hopefully in a reasonable amount of time. And for most firms that I know and many that I work with, your pipeline should contain projects that are going to close in the next 90 days, 120 days, maybe 140 days, that kind of thing. During the pandemic, a handful of years ago, those pipelines got really, really long because projects were slow to close. Yep. So it varies. But in general, it's going to take some months for those projects in your pipeline to close. So we're gonna kind of touch on all of those things. I just wanted to kind of define that and get that sort of picture in people's minds of backlog is now, pipeline is soon, projections are way out there.
And Mark, you wrote a blog post on this topic called Backlog, Pipeline, and the Cliff. And right. I like how you refer to it as a cliff. The imagery on that blog post is very, you can imagine it. If you've ever looked at sales projections, you know exactly what we're talking about when we say the cliff. And so, that blog post is linked in the show notes. So if you're listening to this, go check it out. So Mark, let's get into it. I think that was a great way to tee it up, kind of define what these things are, what a backlog is, a pipeline, and then the revenue that you've closed year to date. Like you mentioned earlier, there's really 3 scenarios that you could be in. Either you're exceeding those expectations of the targets you set, you're exactly where you thought you'd be, or you're not meeting those original revenue targets at this mid-year point. So let's start kind of at the beginning. Hopefully you've set those revenue goals to begin with, but let's start there. I guess, what are the different ways that firms can maybe set those goals? And then how does how do you take the methodology that you use to set those goals and then apply that to kind of looking out at the rest of the year?
Good place to start. There are a number of ways that firms can come up with the number. And when I say the number, is the number, right? And that's supposed to echo the number, right? What is your total expected revenue over the course of your year, which is typically a calendar year over the 12 months? How do you come up with that? There's a bunch of different ways, some good ways. A lot of firms will look at historical data. They'll look at what they did in the last few years or so. Maybe there's some growth projected. Maybe there's some changes there, so they'll kind of add some dollars there. Others will do some calculations where they're looking at their revenue per employee. They can look at that both historically, and there's also some fantastic sort of industry-wide kind of standards on those numbers. You can calculate your potential revenue by taking how many total working hours do you have as a team, your billable time, multiply that by some billing rate if you're basing your business on hours, and you come up with this big number that says, okay, here's all our billable potential hours, here's the rates, the hourly rates we want to associate with that. There's our total revenue. Other firms will use some sort of a multiplier where they'll understand what their direct labor costs are, because they know there's salaries and there's other costs that are carried by their sort of direct labor. They're people who are billable. Mm-hmm. And then they multiply that. Typically, it's plus or minus 3 times that. If you look across a whole lot of industry data, 2.75 to 3.25 in that ballpark. Some firms are even higher than that. Some firms, unfortunately, might be a little bit lower than that. But that's a good place to kind of start. So there's 3 ways: revenue per employee, calculating your potential revenue with this billable time and billable rates, and then the third is using a multiplier of some type, often referred to as the net multiplier. So there's a bunch of ways you can come up with that number. And yes, it is really important to come up with that number. Everybody tends to perform better when you have goals. You can write the big number on the wall. You can all talk about it. It should be something that's discussed regularly, but everybody should have the big number.
Yeah, I think everyone should be able to rally around that number and whatever that is. And that's when I've been a part of healthy sales cultures, there is that. Everyone is working towards that one big number. And it is mentioned often. Revenue per employee, just a quick aside, in the research that I've done in the past, I've seen revenue per employee range pretty wildly from anywhere from like $120K per employee on the low end to anywhere up to like $500K per employee on the high end. And obviously you're going to want that to be higher than lower. But in your experience, what's a typical revenue per employee in professional services firms?
The comment you made about it ranging wildly is so true. And there are select professional services firms who garner $300,000, $450,000, $500,000 annually per employee. And a lot of times the big consulting firms out there that work with very large Fortune 500, Fortune 50 companies, they can hit those dollar amounts. But typically, most of the firms that we see in the marketplace, small to mid-sized professional services firms, are typically between $140,000 to $200,000 annually per employee, and that's total employees. When we just talk about, because a lot of times you can come up with, there's data out there that talks about
revenue per sales employee, revenue, all the different roles.
Technical employees. If you're talking about an engineering firm, it's what's our revenue for just our engineers. But the easy number that I tend to go with is just across the entire organization. We take our revenue and we divide it by the number of FTEs we have, and what's our number. 140 to 200 is pretty standard, and there's a bunch of different factors involved. What you pay people, the cost of living in certain geographies. There's a ton of variables in that, but what you want is a number that lets you compensate your employees well, lets you run a sustainable business, let you have the margin that you want to either increase compensation or to reinvest in your organization. And John, we're consultants to professional services firms. Hopefully, organizations are smart enough and have the ability that there's just a little bit of extra cash laying around that they're able to go out and find skilled consultants, whether it's technology consultants or management consultants or whoever else they are, just to come in and help them when they need a little bit of help. So
Sure.
Firms that have too low of a revenue per employee don't have the margins they want, aren't earning the revenue they want, can't invest in research and development, can't improve their business with help from the outside, that sort of thing.
Between these three different ways that you've helped firms come up with the number, in your opinion, is there a better approach among these three, or does it matter, or is one more common than another?
I don't think so. I think just as long as you can come up with something that's realistic and is a number that that everyone can understand, that you can track well, I think that's fine. It's just simply important to come up with a goal and really share it across the organization and have people kind of understand what it is. Now, reaching your big revenue goal is not the only thing you're chasing after constantly. It can be fatiguing to constantly be chasing after this big, huge revenue number.
Yeah.
There's so many other things that we need to use to motivate individuals to shoot for, to target, other than the big number. You just need to have that number, but there's a lot of other factors that we need to be focused on as well. But that number is important.
So there's different paths to getting to that number. Let's say firms have their number, they've got the number, and they're popping their heads up for air. They're recalibrating their expectations. They're looking at how are they doing mid-year. Let's put ourselves in their shoes right now. So when you've got that number, you understand how you're tracking against that. How does that influence your strategy moving forward?
Yeah. What's important to understand when I talk about revenue to date, I'm not talking about stuff that's actually been paid, dollars that you've received on the sales and the top end revenue. We're talking about contracts. We're talking about contracts that are closed. So you're halfway through the year and you're looking at your total contracts closed, and like you said, maybe you're shy of that number. You're somewhere, right? So what's super important is this underscores the importance of having an organized pipeline, because when you hit the halfway through the year and you start looking around, you're thinking, okay, so we're halfway, maybe we're not quite halfway there, whatever. Where are those future dollars going to come from? Ideally, if you've got an organized pipeline, you can turn to your pipeline and you've got some amount of potential projects, potential work in your sales pipeline that will hopefully make up that shortfall over the rest of the year. Hopefully you've got that pipeline in place. If you do not, that's where the problem starts, and you start scrambling around and people start losing sleep and trying to figure out where the next dollar is coming from. That's the whole critical nature of being organized and having an organized sales pipeline. Hit halfway through the year, if you have a reasonably robust, good-looking sales pipeline, stuff that's going to close over the next 6 months or so, that takes off a lot of the pressure.
Yeah, so let's dig into the pipeline real quick, because it's not necessarily binary, right? Whether or not an opportunity is going to close or not. It really depends on where that deal or opportunity is in its development, in the conversations that you're having with them, and how far along you are in terms of developing a solution for that prospective client. Before we hopped on this recording, Mark, you talked about weighting different stages of the pipeline. Let's dig into that a little bit and how that impacts your projections for the rest of the year.
Right. So when you weight a pipeline, that means you are discounting all the various opportunities that are in your sales pipeline because they haven't closed yet, and they're not a sure thing, and they can range anywhere from we just heard about this opportunity. I just had a quick phone call with John the other day. Timing is not super clear, but we think it's going to happen within this particular time frame. We're going to have a subsequent conversation. This seems like a really good project for us. Let's put it in the sales pipeline because we think it's kind of a qualified opportunity. We think John's a good person to work with. This looks like this is right up our alley, but it hasn't progressed very far. So let's put those dollars in there. If we guessed at this point, it was $100,000 worth of work, but let's discount it heavily because it's just new. So maybe we'll say, okay, we're going to discount that by 90%. So the weighted value of that $100,000 is only going to be $10,000. And that lets us be really conservative about what's in our sales pipeline. Now, other opportunities that are further along, maybe you've been talking to someone else, it's an opportunity that's been in your pipeline for maybe a couple months or so, like 60 days, 80 days, whatever that is. You've had a few conversations, it's progressing, things are becoming clearer and clearer. You're going to weight that more heavily, 20%, 30%, et cetera. You get to the certain point where you're going to, come up with a real proposal to do this work. You're 40%, you're 50%, somewhere in there. So that $100,000, when we've weighted it, $10,000, $20,000, $50,000, not overly optimistic. We're not going to say something jumps in our pipeline and then immediately 2 weeks later, we're going to weight it at 90%. It just doesn't happen that way. But the weighting is critical. So you take all of your pipeline opportunities, they're all weighted slightly differently because some are new, some have been in there for some time. And then you come up with a weighted amount. And that total weighted amount is just a more realistic, more practical way to look at the total value of all of the work that's in your sales pipeline.
And those numbers, the weighted percentages that you have, they don't need to be arbitrary numbers either. I think to your point, if your pipeline is organized, you should be able to go back and look at the conversion rates, not only from, let's just for argument's sake, from lead to opportunity or opportunity to proposal and proposal to closed won, but how many of those leads end up becoming clients. And that proportion is one way that you could approach this and say, okay, well, 12% of leads end up becoming clients, right? So that could be an example of how you could weight the value of a lead when it enters your pipeline.
Agreed. I tend to recommend that any sales stage, when these are the different steps that your opportunities take from a maybe to a close, any sales stage that is prior to a proposal or prior to the point where your prospective client will say yes or no, anything that comes before that moment should be less than 50%, because logically, if someone can say yes or no, you've got a 50-50 chance. So what I tend to recommend is that these early sales stages are weighted 10%, 20%, 30%, walking our way up to that halfway point where when we've proposed, we're having that proposal conversation, we're talking to them about the dollars and cents and the work to be done, et cetera. If they say yes, if we receive some indication that, okay, we're going to move forward now, we need to figure out the details in the contract and the scope of work, great, there's some energy and momentum, we're moving forwards, that percentage usually jumps way up, 80%, 90%, way up there. Because usually these projects will close once we've had some sort of an indication of verbal approval to, okay, we're going to do this. Very rarely do they fall apart in the contract, but they do sometimes.
Sometimes, yeah.
Yeah. So a closed contract is not something where someone has verbally indicated it's a go. It's where you've got the ink on the contract, right? And it's so funny. It's just such an old school term, but I got to tell you, it's so true, right? Yeah. It's just the contract needs to be signed, right? And the great thing about the contract being signed, everybody's got their signatures on it. We're ready to go. So everybody's focused. Okay, now it is time to go. Any moment before that, it's still up in the air.
It ain't over till the fat lady sings.
That too. Yeah. Right. That too.
We talked about weighting your pipeline based on kind of the different sales stages. There's different ways that you could approach that too. You also talked about factoring in opportunity age. So how long has it been in a pipeline? So what are some different indicators that may influence the weight of an opportunity based on the time it's been in your pipeline?
Well, weight is important, and we just talked through it. Let me touch on sort of how I look at age, and I would say that a number of firms out there who get this whole sort of sales pipeline thing, they've heard about weighting. Some firms will say, okay, so we need to have a total pipeline value that's 3 times what we eventually want to close. Okay, that's okay. I think being way more specific and weighting opportunities is more important. But I would also say that those same folks who have a good grasp of weighting aren't really in touch with opportunity age. And I'll drill into opportunity age a little bit here. So opportunity age is the amount of time, that typically days, that it takes you to originate and then contract a new opportunity. And a lot of times this takes way longer than most folks realize. And the important thing about age, and I will try to kind of explain this here without the aid of a whiteboard, is opportunity age is really important because it lets you understand how big your pipeline needs to be. So if on average it takes you 365 days, so an entire year, 1 year, to originate and contract your opportunities, new work, that's a long time. Most firms that I am aware of, it doesn't take that long. But let's just say hypothetically, it takes exactly 1 year. You need to have 1 year's worth of weighted revenue in your pipeline.
Okay.
That makes
okay. I see.
Did that process?
It just took a minute to click, but
it takes a minute. It takes just a minute. If it takes you half a year to close the opportunities that are in your pipeline, on average, you need to have half of a year of weighted revenue in your pipeline, right? Is this all syncing up?
Yep.
If it takes you 1 month on average to originate and close opportunities, you need to have 1 month's worth of weighted revenue in your sales pipeline. So most firms that I work with, 90 days, 120 days, 140 days or so. So if that is the average time it takes them to originate and then close opportunities, they need to have that amount of weighted revenue in their pipelines. That's how this whole number works. And you're thinking, oh, okay, I start to get it now, right? So if we have 90 days, it takes us on average to open and close projects or opportunities, we need to have 90 days of weighted revenue. If our target is $1.2 million for a year, that's $100,000 of revenue per month. 3 months, that's $300,000. We need to have $300,000 of weighted revenue. Now, where the weighting comes from is that, right, that opportunity weighting that we did before. Advanced opportunities have higher percentages, new ones have lower. So that lets us know how we're doing throughout the course of the year. And if you're halfway through the year and you've got about half a year's worth of weighted revenue in your pipeline, you start thinking, okay, we've closed about half. Our pipeline has about half, the other half of the year in weighted revenue. We're doing okay.
Yeah, you're right where you want to be.
Yeah, you're right where you want to be, right? So there's the importance of having an organized pipeline, being able to weight them properly, conservatively, but accurately.
Sure.
And then bring in this whole age thing.
And so I suppose that there are really 2 levers that you can use to impact that, right? So there's the pipeline velocity comes to mind, right? How quickly opportunities move through the pipeline. And not all opportunities are created equal. There's the ones that are, I like to call them silver platter leads, where they're ready to go. They know exactly what you do. They know exactly the value that you provide, and they want to work with you. And so those opportunities tend to move faster through your pipeline. And I think that's a byproduct of great marketing. And we can talk about that in another episode. But I think, that kind of shows you the importance of age and then levers that you can pull to impact the pipeline velocity. Right. And I think the other one is adding new opportunities to the pipeline. So the weight of your pipeline, opportunity age, you can look at those 2 things and you can project out how you're doing against the year. And that should ease your anxiety, or it should really kind of give you a sobering dose of reality and what you need to do and understand and have a clear picture of what you need to do to fill your pipeline.
Right.
So, Mark, you've got a scenario here that I think will help kind of bring this whole concept to life. So you want to walk through the scenario you've got.
Yeah, I've hinted at it in some of the little sort of descriptions that I've used when I'm talking about weighting and I'm talking about age. So here's a scenario, right? You're halfway through your year, your calendar year, your revenue year. You've got a revenue target of $1.2 million. That's $100,000 per month. All makes sense. You've contracted about $500,000 worth of work year to date. So you're almost halfway there. Not too bad, right? You've got another $1.5 million of projects in your pipeline. That's unweighted, right? That's just total potential revenue from all these projects. But we have to weight them, and a lot of them are fairly new. So we're going to weight them fairly heavily. So our weighted value on average, when we do all our calculations up here, we're about $350,000 of weighted revenue. So we've got $500,000 closed and $350,000 likely. So we've got $850,000 towards our annual goal of 1.2 so far. So we can see that $350,000 in our pipeline. We can see it. $500,000 we've got closed. So we're $850 to date, either 100% or pretty darn close there. We're in pretty good shape. So the decision is, do we start freaking out and panicking and chasing a bunch of new opportunities, or do we continue to focus on those pipeline opportunities and continue to we look at that $350,000 and we say, okay, so if we focus on these and they progress, that $350,000 of weighted revenue is going to increase as it moves through our pipeline. So if our average win rate is 45%, and if we end up closing 45% of that $1.5 million that's in our pipeline, that's almost $700,000 worth of revenue. I think it's like $675,000. So the choice is, if we stay focused on that pipeline and we close about $700,000 worth of revenue in the last 6 months of the year, we hit our goal, right? We've closed $500,000 in the first part of the year, $700,000 in the second half. We hit our goal of $1.2 million. Or halfway through the year, did we freak out, stop paying attention to what was in our pipeline, and just go chasing after a bunch of new maybes, right? Now, obviously that's problematic because they're speculative and you're losing focus on the stuff that was in your pipeline to begin with. But the other trick is that if you are starting to add new pipeline opportunities in August, September, October, and your average age of your pipeline opportunities is 100 days, 120 days, 140 days. That stuff that's at the end of the third quarter, into the fourth quarter, is not going to close until the following year. So you're kind of kidding yourself thinking that, oh yeah, we've got all these new opportunities in our pipeline. This is great, but they're not going to close till the first or second quarter next year. So your annual revenue target is at risk.
Yeah, those are great points. So maybe that's not the time to do a bunch of prospecting. That's a time to focus on the opportunities that you have in your pipeline. Therein lies, again, let's hit this note again. It's important to have an organized pipeline so that you can go in there and you can take a look at that. I like how you put that, the $350K, that's going to increase as you pay more attention to it. Those opportunities become proposals. Those proposals they move into a negotiation stage, right? Where the solution's been embraced. It's just a matter of contracting, and that holds a higher weight in your pipeline. I think that all makes sense, Mark. And I think that there's the not having that clarity is what results in firms, to use your words, freak out, or they start to freak out and start to chase new opportunities. So it's cool that we were able to dissect that.
Yeah, it's a great exercise, and firms do need to consider adding new opportunities constantly to their pipelines, even into the third and the fourth quarter, but they can't be under the impression that those are going to close by the end of the year. It's just not how it happens. And you can picture in your mind that whole end of year scramble where the holidays are coming, but you're still trying to close these opportunities in your pipeline. If things get a little bit crazy and people get stressed out, you do need to continue to market and to prospect all in the second half of the year. But the chances are that those opportunities are going to push into the first and second quarter of the next year. And you just have to kind of understand that. And the better people can get their heads wrapped around that whole concept, the easier it is to kind of be able to take in, a full 12 months worth of work and understand what opportunities are started when they're going to close, when do I need to start new opportunities? This whole thing just starts to all make sense in our heads as we picture it and kind of play it out.
Yeah. And for firm owners or folks that are in charge of business development and managing their sales pipeline, managing their forecasts, making sure that they're performing against that, if this is just too much for them to handle, Mark, you offer fractional sales management consulting services, right? So this is something that you help firms do.
Absolutely. Happy to help.
So if you're having trouble with this, if you're a bit overwhelmed, reach out to Mark. He's got you covered.
Very good. Very good. John, this has been a lot of fun. Until next time.
Until next time.
Thanks for listening to Breaking Biz Dev. Subscribe on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or listen to the show at breakingbizdev.com. This episode was produced by Red Cedar Marketing. If you think a business podcast is right for your company, visit redcedarmarketing.com to learn more.